In this lesson, we're going to get our first glimpse of Spring Security in action. We're going to work with a version of the course's project that has been modified to use Spring Security to protect our web application. This project uses a very minimal configuration of Spring Security, the basic building blocks that underlie the framework. We're going to start out by taking a look at the application. So I'm just going to hold Alt, Shift, and hit X, and then hit R again. And remember, that's our shortcut for Run on Server. And I'll just hit Finish. And this is going to launch the application on the Tomcat server. You'll notice it's a little bit different than before because now we're prompted with this login page. And actually, this page is generated by Spring Security. Here, we just need to provide some credentials to authenticate. So I'm going to use the username user and the password password. And that's going to allow me to log into our web application. At the moment, every resource or every request is going to be scrutinized to ensure that the principal is an authenticated user. Once we've authenticated, we can then hit every other area or every other resource within the web application. But in order to make that initial request, we need to then authenticate and we can move about the app. We can refine that security configuration even further to protect some resources, not protect others, to allow some folks into certain resources while others cannot access them. So let's take a look at what it took to put that in place. It all starts with your web.xml file. And within the web.xml file, we specify a simple servlet filter. And the servlet filter is provided by Spring. It's the delegating filter proxy. And we set up the filter mapping to inspect every request coming into the application. You could configure this differently if you would like, but right now I have it set up so the filter receives every request, and then it does some processing on these requests to determine whether they need to be secured. How does it determine the logic for that processing? It's a great question we need to ask. We use the application context.xml file and place security configuration within it. So let's navigate over to that application context.xml file. We have included the Spring Security namespace. We have placed that within our configuration file. And that allows us to use the different elements within that XML configuration. And the important one here is this security:/HTTP tag. And this is basically saying that we're going to be protecting some of the requests coming into this web application. We've set it up for auto configuration, and that's where you get that default login page that it drew for us. Now, there's some other default configuration that happens there. We won't go into that right now. The next line's very important. Here, we're using ANT pattern matching to protect every URL that begins with a /, so pretty much everything. And what we're saying with that access attribute is that we only want to allow users that have the authority of role_user. We only want to allow them access to basically the entire web application, which we could consider a resource here. So what we're setting up here really is an access control role, and that ties into authorization. Well, before we apply those access control roles, we need to make sure the individual is who they say they are. Where this comes into place is in Spring Security's Authentication Manager. This tells us how to check out the principals and their credentials to make sure that we have a valid user on our hands. And we do that by providing an authentication provider. We're just using a user service. That's a Spring Security term we'll talk about. Here we have our entire list of users, and it's one single user with the username of user and the password of password. And then one simple authority granted to them, which is the role_user authority. But that is enough to grant them access to our web application. We're just trying to get a glimpse of the basic building blocks of the framework. Some of the information we gather about the user here then gets applied in the other layers of the application, such as our controller or maybe access to a domain object. This has just been a overview and demonstration of Spring Security in action. We're going to work in a lot more detail, really refining these types of configurations and seeing what they're capable of. And what you're going to find in this course is that Spring Security is going to put a great architecture in place for your application where you're not writing all the plumbing code in order to authenticate and authorize your users to access resources. You're going to focus on your business logic and what's important to you, and you're going to get this consistent model of security throughout your application or any other application you develop using Spring Security.